And we are live.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening to learn more about our district's plans to reopen our schools. I'm Mike Grove, our district superintendent, and I can give a little introduction and context this evening before we begin our presentation. From the start, we've approached reopening as a gradual process, taking steps forward in reopening while balancing student and staff safety. I've been a high school educator for 31 years now, and this has been by far the most challenging experience of my professional career. We've been faced with ever-changing guidelines from multiple entities and extremely dynamic conditions, coupled with enormous anxiety and sadness due to COVID and the loss of key experiences for our students. Perhaps most challenging is the fact that none of us have ever done this before. It's new for all of us, whether you be a student, a staff member, or a parent. We're learning as we go and learning from successes and mistakes along the way. This is also one of those situations where, regardless of what we as a district choose to do, some portion of our community and our staff will be unhappy with our decisions. That is the nature of this situation. But I hope we can all remember that we share the same goal, to do what is best for our students and our staff. We may not always agree upon what is best, but I hope and believe that we can disagree respectfully. Our purpose tonight is to share more detail on the next phase of our reopening planning and to offer some insight into other plans for this spring and for the fall. Everyone wants certainty in this situation, but certainty is in short supply in this time of COVID, and we are doing our best to provide plans in the face of many unknowns. I want to talk briefly about the format of this webinar, as some have asked why it's being hosted as a webinar rather than as an open town hall in which we can engage in live dialogue. So for these kinds of meetings, we use the Zoom platform. And if we want to host it as a town hall, we would be limited to 500 participants. Hosting it as a live streamed webinar allows unlimited participants, but the consequence of that is that we lose the opportunity for live interaction. The last town hall we hosted on reopening resulted in many members of our community being unable. We hosted that as a town hall rather than a webinar, and it resulted in many members of our community being unable to access the event, which excluded them from important information. So we felt it was more important to make sure that every member of our community could have access to tonight's information. And therefore, we provided an alternate means to ask questions via an online form. And we will do our best to answer as many of those questions as we can during the presentation. If they are not addressed during the presentation, we will we will provide all of the FAQs in an online written form. So before we begin with the presentation, I want to acknowledge the many people who have worked incredibly hard to implement distance learning for our students since last March. Those who've run in-person cohorts for our students since June, and those who've contributed to our reopening planning efforts on top of their existing responsibilities. This has been truly been a collaboration involving our board, our district and site administrators, our classified staff members, our teachers, our students, and our families. There are way too many to list individually, but I just wanted to take a minute to acknowledge and thank everyone who has supported our goal of reopening. Finally, I want to acknowledge and thank our students. They have endured very difficult circumstances since last March with a level of grace and resilience that quite honestly constantly amazes me and gives me enormous hope for our future. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our Associate Superintendent of Curriculum and Instruction and HR, soon to be Dr. Carrie Bosco, and she will begin our presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grove. Tonight's school reopening update will include information and updates on our Phase 2 implementation, as well as our Phase 3 planning. Current state and county guidelines and restrictions will be discussed, and information regarding the district's health and safety preparedness. We will share next steps with the rollout plan for Phase 3A and touch on fall 2021. Following the presentation this evening, we will answer frequently asked questions submitted by the Google form. At this time, I'd like to start off with some introductions of our team who will be presenting this evening and who are joining us here. You met Dr. Grove, our superintendent, Dolores Purley, our assistant superintendent of business services, Heath Rocha, chief of student services, Brian Safine, director of human resources, Greg Louie and Paul Robinson, our principals, Tony Palma, director of facilities, Julie Grenier, director of instructional technology, Christopher Ori and Stephanie Rothstein, teachers on special assignment. I'd also like to introduce Jane Marashin from the superintendent's office, who will be supporting us with the Q&A portion of our meeting, and thank Ben Brotzman for helping with the technology. And Ben, if you'd like to pull up the slide deck, we'll get started. Let me go ahead and go to the next slide. This slide we've had in our previous, I guess this is our third town hall. So our previous 2 town halls, as well as a number of board meetings. It's an overview of our phased approach to reopening. We are currently in Phase 2 with a number of students back on campus participating in voluntary cohorts of academic, extracurricular, and athletic activities. Tonight, we will discuss our transition to Phase 3 with the goal of continuing our gradual reopening of schools. And we do remain hopeful that we'll be able to fully reopen in Phase 4 in August. Next slide. Currently at Saratoga High School, we have a number of those Phase 2 and small cohorts. Learning hubs where students come to the campus and participate in remote learning, receive additional support, as well as a number of academic, small cohorts, extracurricular, and again, athletic. This picture here is of Kelly Frangia, one of our math teachers at Saratoga High School, and her small cohort, a math cohort where she is piloting some of our technology with her students remotely at home. The next slide outlines Los Gatos High School's current Phase 2 offerings. Again, you'll see that learning hub. This is a picture of Kathy Messenger's advanced science research, a small cohort that is on campus currently. In total, we have approximately 60 cohorts operating between the 2 sites, serving just around 1,000 students. So I want to thank all of our teachers and staff, our students, as well as our coaches who have helped run these small group activities on site to keep students connected. Next slide, please. At this time, Dr. Grove's going to review the state guidelines for school reopening.
Okay, Ben, next slide, please. So a little bit of background. Schools that were considered to be open prior to our county moving into the purple tier were allowed to remain open and continue with reopening plans while in purple. Schools that were not open prior to the county moving into the purple tier have not been allowed to begin reopening until the county returns to the red tier for 5 consecutive days. So our school district, despite we had large numbers of students participating in cohorts, we were not considered to be open prior to moving into the purple tier. So we're not currently eligible until to reopen and begin our reopening until our county's been in the red tier for 5 consecutive days. The state finally provided a clear definition of what open means, because there was a lot of confusion and misunderstanding of that. So they came out with a fairly succinct definition, and basically means that all students in at least 1 grade level had the option to return for in-person instruction for at least part of the school week to be considered open. And so that allowed, that language is friendlier to elementary schools who might open for all of first grade. At the high school level, because we have so many classes that are mixed grade levels, it's virtually impossible for us to open for a particular grade. So that definition was a little bit more friendly for elementary to reopen rather than secondary schools. And then finally, schools that were serving grades K through 6 that were not open were eligible to apply for a waiver to reopen during purple. This waiver was not available to schools serving grades 7 through 12. So we had a lot of people ask, why didn't we apply for a waiver? We didn't apply for a waiver because a waiver was not available to us as a high school district. Next slide, Ben. The current criteria for reopening that was kind of clarified and reinforced in the middle of January from the state for K through 6 schools. The K through 6 schools are eligible, that were obviously that were not already open, are eligible to reopen for in-person instruction while in the purple tier if adjusted case rates for the county is less than 25 cases per 100,000 of population per day for at least 5 consecutive days. For 7 through 12 schools, which is our district, we don't have the opportunity to reopen in purple. We have to wait, as I mentioned before, until our county is in the red tier for at least 5 consecutive days. And that's a reduction. The previous guidelines before the middle of January said that we had to be in the red tier for 14 consecutive days, and they reduced that number down to 5. So that's the current criteria by which we can reopen. Ben, next slide. So the criteria, once we reopen, the criteria for how we stay open and under the conditions under which we would need to shut back down, the state also provided guidance for that. So once reopened, the school can remain open even if our county returns to a more restrictive tier. So if we're able to reopen under the red tier or the orange tier, and there are, if we have the unfortunate situation where COVID makes a comeback and we return from orange to red or from red to purple, we are allowed to stay open and to continue with any reopening planning once we're open. Once we are open, the decision to close a school will be made in consultation with the county public health department, and generally would be based upon either of two conditions. That within a 14-day period, an outbreak has occurred in 25% or more of a stable groups in the school, or within a 14-day period, at least 3 outbreaks have occurred in the school and more than 5% of the population is infected. Those are general guidelines that the state put out. The local health officer is ultimately has the authority to determine whether a school closure is warranted based upon those conditions or other reasons, including results from a public health investigation or other local epidemiological data. Next slide. So there also has been confusion over the criteria for moving from tier to tier. So counties are assigned a tier based upon 2 metrics: test positivity in the county and adjusted case rate for the county. And per current state guidance, school reopening is based upon is obviously based upon tier, which is based upon those 2 things. The red tier, the adjusted case rate to move into the red tier for our county has to be 7 per 100,000 for 5 consecutive days. And the test positivity rate has to be 8 or less for 5 consecutive days. So that's the kind of metric that we're looking at that would trigger our legal ability to reopen. And then you can obviously see the numbers for orange and yellow. Next slide, Ben. Sorry, the slide that I was referring to wasn't up. So the slide that I was just referring to is there on the screen for you. So the red indicates 7 per 100,000 and a test positivity rate of 8 or less. Next slide, Ben. So our current, this is as of Wednesday. The county updates this data every Wednesday afternoon. And so this data is as of Wednesday, February 3rd, yesterday. The county adjusted case rate currently is 21.5. And as I mentioned before, we have to get to 7 or less to move into the red tier. Our case positivity rate, you can see there, is actually 4.9. The graphs show you the adjusted case rate is the solid line, and the unadjusted case rate is the dotted line on that graph. Next slide, Ben. This slide depicts the case positivity rate. So you can see obviously the surge that we just went through, and we are seeing declines. And the test positivity rate has actually dropped down into the level of what would be appropriate for the red tier. So we're doing well with our test positivity rate as a county. That would allow us to be in the red tier. We're waiting on the adjusted case rate to trigger the red tier for the county. Next slide, Ben. And this is just kind of the total accumulated case count and the 7-day rolling average of new cases. So obviously the surge from December and January and seeing significant declines countywide over the last 3 to 4 weeks, which is good news for all of us. So that's an update on the criteria under which we can reopen and our current status in terms of the tiers for our county. We hope to continue to see declines in the adjusted case rate that will allow us to begin to move forward. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Greg Louie, the principal of Saratoga High School, and he's going to talk a little bit about the guidelines for youth sports, which applies to high school athletics.
Good evening. So as you can see, the state had a variety of outlines of ways that we could be able to conduct high school sports. So the conditioning, the practice, the skill building and training, that was all permitted as we had been doing both at Los Gatos and Saratoga, assuming the fact that it could be done outdoors, that it was 6 feet of physical distancing, and done in stable cohorts. And our student athletes at both schools and the coaches were fully aware of that and did a great job of following those restrictions. When we started talking about competitions and games, the second bullet outlines the fact that any kind of within team scrimmages were permitted. Again, being the fact that it maintained some distance. In the purple tier, the outdoor low contact sports are basically what it is that we have available for our season 1 sports right now, being cross country, golf, swimming, diving, track and field would be in the season 3. The inter-team competition is when the question was, could we compete with other schools? And it wasn't up until just more recently where they had indicated the fact that we could play against other teams within our county and potentially those in schools that are immediate counties next to us. So again, those are things that have to be considered. And again, it goes by colored tiers, which you'll see on the next slide. So there's 2 things on this slide to note. One is this is the Santa Clara Valley Athletic League plan that was adopted by the Board of Managers with the intention of trying to give our sports an opportunity to be able to play sometime during this semester. So right now we just started at both schools the season 1 purple sports, which, as I said earlier, cross country, golf, tennis, swimming, and diving. Season 2 is going to pick up March 1st, and optimistically we will be in red or orange by then, so that way we can have field hockey football, soccer, badminton, and volleyball for our ladies. And potentially, if we get so far into yellow, then we can start enjoying competitive cheer. And then season 3, as you can read, begins April 5th. And again, as we ideally move from left to right, more and more of our student athletes can be able to compete in their respective sports. So that essentially is the sports side of things for our league. And now going back to Ms. Bosco for next slide.
Thank you, Mr. Louie. So in this next section, we're going to be talking about our reopening planning, and we'll start off with an introduction of Phase 3A. On the next slide, we would like to share with you our approach. So as we look at Phase 3A, we're calling it Every Student, Every Teacher, and it continues our gradual approach to reopening, and it allows our staff and students to learn how to implement our health and safety protocols and procedures, as well as trial the technologies that will be needed for us to simulcast when we expand to a full hybrid this spring. In the 3A model, students will attend classes once per week with additional opportunities for in-person activities. The strategy limits the risks associated with cohort mixing. Because at the high school level, our courses are leveled in English, math, science, social studies, and in the electives, the full hybrid or a 3B model will not entail stable cohorts, and therefore we have a concern about increased transmission risk. Next slide, please. In addition, the 3A approach does not disrupt the current instructional model. Students will continue with their courses on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. It allows our teachers to manage the challenges of simultaneous in-person and online instruction before we shift to that full hybrid approach. It also provides the opportunity for us to address the social emotional needs of our students by providing a connection for students and teachers that is in person and on Wednesdays. It also allows students to receive additional academic and social emotional support, and will provide more opportunities for students to participate in those small cohort activities that you heard we've been implementing in the Phase 2 model. In this next slide, I'm going to introduce Christopher Ori, one of our teachers on special assignment, to talk more about the 3A approach.
Hi, good evening. So 3A can look different for every teacher, and part of 3A is actually giving teachers an opportunity to make it their own and get comfortable with it. So as Ms. Bosco talked about, 3A can be used for, frankly, it's that for some teachers, the first opportunity to have a face-to-face with their students. So having some of that social emotional and community building, it could be an opportunity for follow-up support. So giving more of a tutorial type approach, giving special, lab demonstrations or hands-on activities, engaging in some in-person discussions, and yet still students who are at home in a fully remote model will be able to participate through a simulcast model and be able to check in with the teachers if they can't via the office hours. And I could share a little bit about my experience, but first I wanted to share and introduce Matthew Holm. He's a physics teacher and computer science teacher at Los Gatos High School. He's also a part of our F2C committee on reopening. And so he has some insight on how he would share it. So Ben, if you could click.
I am so excited to see students in person again. Just this week in physics, I was doing a demonstration of Lenz's law, where if you take a magnet and you drop it through a copper pipe, it falls more slowly. And though you can see that on a screen, it is more impactful and meaningful and beautiful, frankly, to see it in person. And there are so many other things. I'm excited to have a class discussion and to know that a comment or a nonverbal communication from over here will be a response to a comment from over here, and not just because there's construction happening outside or a cat ran in the room. What I really like about this Wednesday as a first step is that it gives us flexibility, and it's not during the scheduled class time, so it's not like this is content time. It gives us flexibility to nurture relationships and to introduce ourselves, frankly, to students who we haven't seen in person for the entire year. Can't wait.
And so you'll hear a little bit more about the schedule and the timing of it here in just a second. But as Mr. Holm kind of talked about, it's that opportunity to make a connection with our students. Back in November and December, I was experimenting with different technology that we could possibly use to make a hybrid model or simulcast work. And so I was teaching my students from a classroom, fully remote. And I'll be honest, it's a lot to manage between the managing the technology of the microphones and the cameras, managing teaching with a mask, and then trying to navigate the content and the instruction. So having this 3A opportunity is a great opportunity for teachers to get comfortable with that flow, because hybrid teaching is very, very different from remote teaching, which has been very, very different from traditional teaching. And so that phase of 3A allows teachers to make those connections, but also get comfortable with the manner in which we would do a hybrid model before we really start going into a full-blown hybrid model. And so next we'll see the schedule.
I am so excited to see.
Thank you, Mr. Ori. So this is a look at the Phase 3A schedule. You'll notice the Monday, Thursdays, Tuesdays, and Fridays are exactly the same. It's the Wednesday asynchronous day that captures the Phase 3A model. Group A will come in the morning on Wednesdays for a 60-minute period with one of their classroom teachers. That period will rotate each week to another one of their classroom teachers. Again, it's every student, every teacher. We want them to be able to make those connections. Christopher and Mr. Holm already spoke about some of the different activities that they will use during those 60-minute sessions to connect with their students and provide them additional support. Following that period, the district is working with the goal to have small cohort activities for all the students that are interested in participating. Learning labs, academic cohorts, extracurriculars, and athletics. We are also working with the Los Gatos Saratoga Recreation Department to provide additional in-person activities during this time, such as yoga, homework support, to expand the offerings that the district already has in place. There will then be an opportunity for staff to continue with that collaboration, professional development, curriculum planning, and to have their lunch. We'll also clear the campus at that time and rotate to our Group B period. Same as Group A, it'll be the first Wednesday we do this. It'll be first periods for the different cohorts, and then it'll rotate in future weeks. Again, another section for small cohort activities after the Group B or the afternoon group. Group A will be 9 to 10 a.m. Group B will be 1 to 2 p.m. with small cohort activities after each of those. And then students will have asynchronous time and teachers will have office hours at the end of the day, as they do now. Next slide, please. So the conditions for returning to Phase 3A are when our staff will return to campus are whichever comes first. Santa Clara County is in the red tier, and all of our staff have had the opportunity, and that includes eligibility and access, to get the recommended doses of the COVID vaccine, or if the Santa Clara County is in the orange tier. We'll also provide staff and students at least 2 weeks notice to prepare for returning to campus. Next slide. So what are other high schools doing in Santa Clara County in our area as with respect to Phase 3 reopenings, full hybrids? You can see a list of our area high school districts, including Mountain View, Los Altos, Palo Alto, Fremont Union High, Campbell Union High, Eastside, and San Jose Unified and Milpitas. We're all in about the same spot with Phase 2 targeted cohorts. Some districts have come out and announced that they don't expect to open middle school or high school this year. Others are working to get the targeted cohorts in Phase 2 in line. Others have started looking at conditions just like we are for reopening. You can see San Jose Unified will reopen if a vaccine is available to all, or they go orange. And Santa Clara Unified has indicated they will not open any schools until orange as well. Next slide. And I'm going to hand this over to Dolores, our Assistant Superintendent for Business Services.
Okay, so the plan covers some broad areas in funding, safety mitigation, oversight and assistance, transparency, and accounting. I'll be talking a little bit about the funding. The other portions will be covered a little later in the presentation. So in the current year, 2021, we received $1.3 million in funding, and that was to cover a variety of things related to both COVID and distance learning, as well as making plans for reopening. Next slide, please. We have spent that funding on in some basic areas. You can see some specifics on those, but student and staff support, providing tutoring and mentoring for our students, some mental health support, professional development, additional licenses to assist with distance learning. We've also purchased some equipment that will help us with reopening, and some of the health and safety items needed as we plan for reopening. In addition to this funding, which came in, there are current talks at the legislative level. There's proposals out there that are working their way through the system. None of them are approved yet for additional funding that will help with reopening costs. Next slide.
So when we look at a reopening plan and how we can support students and staff, health and safety is our number one concern. Next slide. We've looked at, and as we've discussed in a few other venues, the 144 separate rules and regulations that have been recommended for the reopening of any school. These were put out by the state of California, the County of Santa Clara, and then our own internal teams of teachers, staff, work together to refine that list. And with that 144 items, we've been working through each of them to implement those recommendations to ensure that we have a safe facility for our staff and students upon a return, either in a hybrid 3A or, as we are in right now, our 2A section. Some of the notable preparedness actions include our HVAC filters, some sneeze guards at very common areas. We have been accumulating PPE, our personal protective equipment, that the state had given us an allocation, and then we've been collecting our own for the time when school reopens so we can distribute that. We have invested in electrostatic misting systems. We're looking at, or excuse me, we have purchased and have been using UVC disinfection. So in our areas where we need to triage due to a possible infection, we immediately roll in the UVC and run that system for the 15 to 20 minutes before then misting. We've got social distancing signages that we've been working on, hand sanitizer that we've been accumulating in the pallet load by gallon. We are also investing in specialty signage, UV and HEPA air filtration, traffic maps to accommodate one-way traffic in the schools to reduce the chance of student face-to-face interaction through hallways, training for staff, and of course, the employee screening procedures. And we'll show some examples of that on the next slide. So we've got our air filters. You can see some of the floor markings that we've been preparing to implement when we do the return to school, our electrostatic cleaning that we do after every cohort. And then we also put these notices on doors or hang tags in classrooms to indicate that a area or facility was cleaned so that the staff can feel comfortable in coming in the next day. We have our staff screenings at each site, including the district office, where staff check in through a QR code. They fill out a questionnaire, take their temperature, and hand sanitize before entering the facility. Next slide. Again, we have various sneeze guards in our offices in common areas. We've implemented some sneeze guards that are more permanent. And then, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner, we have some mobile sneeze guards that can be set up for students or staff members in their offices or in their classrooms to in the various locations where they want to move from a desk to a table or whatnot. Our safety signage has been prepared and is printing some, and then again, some we're waiting to hold until we are ready to open. And of course, our MERV 13 upgraded air filters, which were the recommended air filter by Santa Clara County. Next slide. We're also going to be doing room assessments, and we continue to do these room assessments, but before we have a phase 3 return, all of our classrooms will have a posting of a sign that looks like this. It will include the room number, the maximum occupancy allowed in that room based on COVID standards in terms of the 6-foot distancing. It'll include the type of air filtration that is installed and the minimum level of fresh air that the room can provide. And all of that will be used to define how many students can be in a space and make that determination of which class will be in that room. And what that means is some rooms that a teacher may have been teaching in, they may have to move for a certain period to accommodate the size of class or size of cohort that they have returning. But this will be up in every room of each campus, and it'll be a good assurance for the staff and the students to know how many people can be in there and that they can feel comfortable about the work that we've been doing behind the scenes. Next slide. One of the other things that we wanted to highlight is the fact that the CDC, the county, and pretty much everybody is saying the best things to do are don't go outside when you're sick or feeling ill, wear a face covering and practice good hygiene, and stay 6 feet away from others. And that has been the number one thing that the county Department of Health has been pushing for all schools. And so these are 3 specific rules that they have implemented that we want to highlight. And the first is screening, and that schools must implement a system and exposure screening for all staff and students at home each day before leaving for school. And we are currently using a combination of digital and paper screening forms. For athletic events, the coaches felt the paper screening was easier to do on the fields with clipboards. And some of our teachers are using systems like Teach More or some other check-in systems to determine what the the best way to screen. And we're using that and evaluating that and looking at some different web-based applications that would be directly integrated into our ARES system. That way we can have students tracked more efficiently. Our admin teams can see who checked in and who did not check in. And upon a phase 3 return to campus, our sites will be able to use a digital system to screen all students and staff before leaving for school each day. Next slide. Face coverings is another requirement. It was that schools must teach and enforce the required use of face coverings and hygiene. So enforcing that, it becomes a challenge. Some students wear them in the classroom and then they leave and go to the parking lot, take them off, and maybe they're interacting with others with it off because it's more comfortable. But we need to ensure that all students and staff wear their face coverings and practice regular COVID health hygiene while on campus at all times. So we have disposable face coverings for students who may forget theirs at home. We have signage that we're going to have throughout campus to remind staff and students about COVID protocols. You can see some of that signage there. Sanitizer is available in all classrooms and offices for regular use. Students will be getting training when they come back to campus that first week in a 3A. One of the things we'll be covering is some of the protocols, and that'll either go out in video form or through a short conversation. But it's going to define what those expectations are while on campus. And we will continue to have our campus supervisors patrol the sites to ensure that social distancing and face covering requirements are being followed. Next slide. So the last one is this physical distancing requirement. And student chairs must be kept at least 6 feet from one another, except they've added this caveat, except where not possible after a good faith effort. But under no circumstance should distance between student chairs be less than 4 feet. Now, prior to a phase 3 return to classroom, our furniture will be arranged by the staff to accommodate the maximum allowable students per room. This again will be taking into account the square footage, the air ventilation, and those other factors I discussed before. Now, the setup and layout of each space is really going to be determined by the teacher, who's teaching in that space. We want to make sure that it's organized in a way that'll facilitate the desired learning experience. As you talked with and saw Matt Holm, he talked about the value of his education and having students back in the room in a certain way. We want to make sure that you can do that safe, but maybe a very large circle is more beneficial to him than straight rows where he doesn't get to see all the kids exactly well. So we want to allow that flexibility while still maintaining the 6-foot distancing requirement. So students are going to be assigned to specific seats, and the unused desks or chairs in the room will be marked off as not available. You can see some examples there in those photos. Again, these are the 3 really key things that the county has been emphasizing and that we've been working through, in addition to the very many other 144 different elements that we have to implement in our sites. Next slide. Brian?
Thank you, Tony. I'm excited to talk about our testing plans, both what we're looking to do in the future and what we've already done at our 2 sites. So our plan is to test our staff members twice monthly. The tests are focused on asymptomatic staff members who have been coming to campus. So Carrie and others have mentioned the cohorts that are back and the teachers leading them. We also have a number of our classified staff members back on campuses. Our office staffers, our custodial, our maintenance, our grounds crew, our cafeteria. So testing is open to all staff, not just the teachers. So the tests have been self-administered. They're the oral swabs. After each employee tests, they put the sample in a bag. The bag is scanned and then shipped to the lab in Southern California. In our first go round on January 27th, all staff members received results within 48 hours after testing, and we had no positive results from the first 47 tests. In fact, they were all negative except for one where the sample size wasn't sufficient. So we're very grateful for that. We are looking at student testing for a potential return. The current company we're using, Curative, says they are able to accommodate the roughly 3,500 students in our district. We're also consulting with other districts to find out about their testing companies and the corresponding capacities. Next slide, please. We will continue to commit to safety as a school district. Dr. Grove mentioned this at the outset tonight, that student and staff safety has been paramount. It's certainly my focus as Human Resources Director. In this slide, you see a picture of the custodial and maintenance staff at Saratoga meeting socially distanced with masks to receive the latest and greatest instruction related to running and maintaining a safe campus. All our administrators have been trained in both responding to confirmed and suspected cases of staff and students. In instances where a student involved in a cohort or staff member is tested positive or come into close contact with a positive case, he or she is immediately isolated and informed of the proper health care and quarantine steps. The district COVID response team has been referring to and acting on the guidance set up by both the state of California and the Santa Clara County Public Health Department. We've linked these guidelines in many emails, in many newsletters, and many communiques to our family. For those who haven't seen it, the county breaks down each of the 4 COVID scenarios into different numbers, and the corresponding reaction from our staff depends on which kind of scenario we're looking at. So there are many of us on this call who spend quite a bit of time looking at the scenarios and responding in kind, again, with the priority of maximizing safety for our community. With that, I will turn things over to Heath Rocha.
Yeah, next slide, Ben. So we wanted to share with you some of the support we've provided students and staff since we went into shelter in place. For our students, as Ms. Bosco shared, we've had many cohorts on campus for both extracurricular and academic. We've also provided weekly tutoring for students with 2 or more D or Fs. We generated those lists last fall at the 6 and 12 week. And last week we had 188 students receiving weekly tutoring, and they could be in as many 4 separate tutoring sessions per week. In addition, provide CASI individual and group counseling. We have our weekly advisory period where we're delivering social emotional learning standards. Also for those students struggling both academically and social emotionally, offering both staff mentoring and peer tutoring. And then for those students and families requiring intensive mental health services, we've partnered with 2 agencies to provide wraparound family services in the home. And that include family counseling, parent coaching, and additional individual. For staff, we've operated a number of professional development and curriculum planning opportunities, as well as our district employee assistance program. And a new add-on that actually Mr. Safine spearheaded was a professional development series focused on resilience. Next slide. I think that's back to you, Brian.
Yeah, Ben, could you advance to the next slide? Thank you. So just to let folks know about our communication plan, I'm going to summarize some of the steps we've taken, and then we're going to answer some questions during the Q&A about communication. So we'll hit it here. Julie Grenier is going to finish our slide deck, and then we'll lead into the Q&A. So tonight we're hosting the public webinar regarding implementation of Phase 3A. We're continuing to refine the health and safety protocols to ensure a safe reopening for students and staff. As you heard from Mr. Palma, we are purchasing additional technologies related to health and safety. We will have shared, and will continue to share the 3A reopening plan with our stakeholders. We will soon be sending a commitment survey to students and families about their intent to return. We will continue to work with our employee associations and provide in-person substitutes for staff unable to return in person. Again, we'll hit on that in the Q&A as well. And we will continue to plan for a 3B return this spring. That's the goal. 3A first with the transition to 3B later on in the spring. Thanks, Ben. Next slide.
Thanks, Brian. So as Brian said, our goal is to get to a 3B this spring. And so we're actively planning for 3B, which will be a hybrid model where students will return to campus part-time for their classes, most likely 2 days a week. Our goal is to transition from 3A to 3B sometime later this spring as a way to expand the in-person learning for our students and to more broadly implement the related technology and safety protocols in case we also have to return in a hybrid model in the fall of 2021. So during all of the phases, including 3A and 3B, we'll continue to monitor the local health conditions and the state and county guidelines for physical distancing and cohorts. And we'll use these to finalize our Phase 3B plan, and we will share that out with everyone, and we'll give you examples of what it will look like in practice, and we'll have another one of these town halls most likely for your questions and feedback. Can we have the next slide, please, Ben? And then finally, fall 2021 reopening. So assuming that all the national, state, and local regulations allow us to do so, we will open the fall in one of 2 scenarios. The first one is the one we all want. It's the one that's a full reopening for all of our students with no separate cohorts on a normal 5-day-a-week in-person school schedule. But this assumes that our social distancing requirements that are given to us by the state and county will allow us to run normal size classes. If the social distancing requirements are still in place in August, that requires to maintain a greater level of distance between our students and our staff, then we're going to need to have smaller class sizes. So we will reopen a 2 cohort model that would include a mix of in-person and online learning. And that's the hybrid approach we've been talking about. But student immunization will not be a condition of opening in the fall. Next slide, Ben. All right, that's the end of our slideshow. We are going to move into the question and answer section, and Jane Marashin is going to lead that for us.
So the first question is about the webinar and the Q&A format. And the question is, how will all of the questions you received through the form get answered?
So, I can answer that one. So as you know, we have been collecting questions over this online form, and we've reviewed these questions as they've come in and consolidated them. We've been doing it all day yesterday, and we've got most of them in through this morning. We collected these questions because this way we could group them into different categories see if there were duplicates or ones that were very similar, and make sure we could answer as many of your questions as possible. This also helped us determine which ones were most pressing for you this evening and which ones we could put into an FAQ later, which will be posted on our websites. And we will continue to look at this form and answer any more questions that came in during this live stream, and answer those questions in our FAQ online as well.
The next question is about student vaccines. The question is, the majority of the questions we received have to do with vaccines based on a communication that went out last week. The clarification message was sent yesterday, but we want to address the many parents who submitted questions asking for clarification regarding our reopening timeline with respect to whether or not we are requiring students to be vaccinated prior to reopening. Examples of these questions included, why do you think it is appropriate to mandate a vaccine for students in order to return to school in fall? And alternatively, why can't we wait until vaccines are given out to staff and students to return to school? Mike, I think that's yours.
Yep. So as was noted on one of the recent slides, vaccinations for students is not and will not be a condition for in-person learning in the fall or in the spring, obviously. All students who want to return in person will have the opportunity to do so regardless of the availability of a vaccine for teens, while those who still don't feel safe returning until they're vaccinated will have the choice to remain at home. For those who have questions about, and we did receive a number of questions about why we would even consider returning at all before students are vaccinated. We believe that there are very real academic and social emotional benefits to returning to school, while the risks are mitigated when we reach the red and orange tiers. So it's really kind of a question of sort of risk tolerance, and we believe that the benefits of doing so outweigh the risks, particularly because those who aren't comfortable with the risks will have the option to stay at home. We're not going to force any students to return to school, nor are we going to force anyone to get vaccinated if they don't have the desire to do so. So I think obviously we had the communication that got sent out last week, fully owned that it was the wording of one particular line created confusion around that. So just want to be very clear about that.
The next question, what is the district doing to get the teachers vaccinated, and when is that expected?
Thanks, Jane. That's my question. This is in the human resources world, both for our school district and districts around the county, the most popular question of the day. It's what everyone wants to know. Many of you who are watching tonight probably saw the very recent news that countywide, the expectation is that those over 65 years of age would be able to receive a vaccination, of course, contingent on supply, at whichever location has enough supply. So that's brand new information. As folks, as I'm sure have heard, the other priority folks for in terms of receiving the vaccination were healthcare workers, those working in long-term care facilities. The first round was those 75 and over as well. We constantly monitor the public health department website. We monitor the websites of the insurance providers, and there's no specific timeline, unfortunately, regarding educator vaccination in Santa Clara County. I share the frustration of my colleagues in terms of them wanting specificity about vaccination details. I'm a big believer in controlling what we can control and messaging as much as we can as soon as we know it. I will continue to track this for all our staff members and for the good of the community, and inform everyone as soon as we know the timing of vaccination here in our county.
The next question is about the conditions for return. And the question is, what is the rationale behind going above what Governor Newsom is recommending for safe return to school this year? Orange tier versus red tier. And Mike, that's yours, I think.
So Well, the governor has made some general statements about his desire for schools to reopen. We're still beholden to the rules of the California Public Health Department as well as our county public health department. As mentioned earlier, we will reopen in the red tier if staff have the ability to get vaccinated. The news today that our county is moving to the 65 and older is good news for us. We anticipate that educators will be the next group that becomes eligible. I was a little more pessimistic yesterday than I am today about how quickly our staff is going to get vaccinated. Our staff continue to have, some members of our staff continue to have serious concerns for their own safety as well as the safety of their family. In a full hybrid model, each teacher would be exposed to approximately 150 students multiple times each week. And approximately 30% of our staff have indicated that they will not return until they're vaccinated. If we were to try to reopen our schools and didn't have 30% of our staff, we wouldn't be able to run our schools because we quite simply, there aren't enough people out there to go out and hire to replace that percentage of our staff. So we would be in trouble. So that is why we are looking to either orange when the risk is even more mitigated, or the risk is mitigated through staff vaccines.
The next question is about stable cohorts. The question reads, I have recently seen several news headlines declaring that it is safe to open schools, including from the New York Times. But if you read the articles, it's clear that the study has determined schools are relatively safe if specific precautions are taken, including students being grouped into cohorts. I'm concerned a lot of community members may have read the headlines and immediately pushed for a full reopening without fully understanding the details of the study. I know you've done this in the past, but can you please reiterate the difference between elementary students who stay in a single classroom together for the full day versus high school students who move from one room to another each period? And how do you plan to have stable cohorts if we open this school year, given that high schoolers move from class to class? And Carrie, I think that's you.
Thanks. Creating stable cohorts, it is easier at the elementary levels, and I think that's why we're hearing of so many elementary schools reopening and with plans to reopen. Even now in our feeder districts, they have one teacher and a cohort that they can stay with all day, whereas at the high school level, stable cohorts just are not achievable. Our students participate in leveled classes for English, math, science, social studies, electives. So we won't be able to do that. We will not be able to do stable cohorts in a full hybrid in a 3B model. And that is an area of risk or concern. In the 3A model, students will attend classes just once per week, and it'll limit the cohort mixing, both for students and for staff. We just learned today from one of our parents that they receive a letter from Fisher Middle School, who's been open at the 6th grade level for just a week. A positive COVID case in the 6th grade closed down a class. For us in a full hybrid model, if we had a teacher or a staff member test positive, it would require us to close down 5 classes or 5 cohorts. So the concern about transmissibility and stable cohorts is there.
Next question about phased in return. Is there any possibility that students will go back to even hybrid learning this spring or fall? That's for Paul.
So I can answer that. Yes, our goal is to transition from the 3A to 3B at some point this spring as a way to both expand our in-person learning and to test the related technology and safety protocols in case we have to open in the hybrid model come this fall. As discussed in the presentation, the phased-in approach allows us to implement 3A with all the intricacies involved in schedules and safety while analyzing the impact in practice before we get to the next phase.
Next question is about the hybrid. It says, if we do not resume full-time in the fall, what hybrid model are you envisioning? 2 days a week, 5 days a week? Please be transparent with us so we can make informed decisions for our families and children. That's Carrie.
Thank you. So as discussed during the presentation, social distancing requirements, if they're in place in August, that will force us to be in a hybrid model. In that situation, we would have to have a mix of online learning and in-person learning. The hybrid approach in the current model that we are exploring involves each cohort attending 2 full days per week every week. However, there are additional models that we are exploring for fall if needed. We will share a full hybrid plan in the coming weeks, and we'll again host an opportunity to share this information with the public and seek feedback. We anticipate that the 3B model might be employed this spring, and that will allow us to learn about any adjustments we would need to make for hybrid model for fall. We'll likely not know whether or not we'll have to open in the fall in the hybrid model until in the summer. So it's dependent upon the state and county social distancing requirements and health conditions at that time.
The next question, what are the conditions for a full return to campus, i.e. phase 4? Do you think that all students will return to campus in the fall? And that is Mr. Louie.
Thank you. So as was stated before in the presentation, the conditions to return for full phase 4 is going to be dependent upon national, state, and local regulations. Hopefully that happens, right? Because we would all love that to happen. In terms of, will all the students return to campus in the fall? Again, the idea is that we would be able to offer a full reopening with no separate cohorts, a regular traditional 5-day-a-week in-person school schedule. But again, this is all under the assumption of what Carrie just described, that we need to maintain the social distancing requirements or not to be able to have the normal size classes. So we're optimistic, and we can all say a prayer.
Next question about COVID testing. We've received questions about our plan for COVID testing for students and staff and whether the district can mandate students and staff participate. Brian?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. As I alluded to during the presentation, we have a contract with Curative and are testing our staff every 2 weeks. We continue to explore our options for student testing. Again, upon our return, we would hope to implement student testing. Every bit of legal advice we've heard indicates that we can highly recommend testing, but cannot mandate testing. That seems to be the latest from various health authorities.
Again, another question about COVID testing. Has there been any attempt by the district to count how many staff and students have tested positive for COVID during remote learning, including students who have not gone to campus, to get an idea of how frequently quarantine would be happening?
Well, it's very challenging to know the numbers for folks who haven't been to campus. I would be dishonest if I said I had a precise number for those who aren't on campus. The other challenge is having folks, when they come, let us know whether or not they've been exposed or they're positive. For the known positive cases, we are tracking, we are responding to public health. Public health is contacting people who have been exposed. In terms of known cases, our number is around 10, maybe slightly over 10. In terms of positive cases for staff and students who have been on campus across our district. Of course, that number is likely much higher for those who are off campus. But again, we don't have a way to accurately track that data. Tony Palma mentioned the health screening apps, which we would employ upon students' return to campus, be it in a 3A or 3B model. But as of now, with just volunteer cohorts returning, we are tracking those who haven't been on campus.
A slight change of pace, PE requirements. Given the uncertainty of when life will return to normal, any thoughts on students filling gym requirements if sports don't return, especially for juniors and seniors whose time window is shortened and want to do a sport that may not happen? How is virtual gym handled this year?
Yeah. Well, students are enrolled in PE classes and they'll continue to participate therein remotely. We are planning to look at alternate ways to award or waive PE credit as it's needed, especially for students who might be juniors and seniors and who are unable to complete an athletic season due to circumstances beyond their control. As of right now, we are not canceling any of our athletic seasons, as Mr. Louis pointed out. So students are not going to be penalized when a situation is out of their control.
The finals question. We had a student inquire about finals this year. She wrote, I and other students I've talked to are not mentally able to handle the stress of a final during the pandemic. Mr. Ori?
Yeah, so teachers will be given the same encouragement and support to think differently about finals in the second semester, just like they were in the first semester. Many teachers last semester used alternative forms of assessments, such as projects, presentations, portfolios, student work, etc. So all of these different opportunities will provide students opportunities to show their understanding. And so we'd anticipate it's going to be the same, if not better, in the spring semester. Plus, we don't yet know whether we'll be in full, well, we'd assume that we will have some ability to come back together. So there may be other ways that teachers come up with to assess learning.
Next question is extracurriculars. We've received a number of questions about extracurriculars, activities, and graduation for seniors. Will there be consideration to having a graduation for all seniors and family members who feel comfortable attending? Students have all missed junior prom, possibly senior prom, varsity sports, no senior homecoming, or any of the other senior traditions. What are you doing special for our seniors to celebrate their senior year? Mr. Louis is going to handle that one.
So as the new principal for Saratoga High School, I have yet to actually experience a real graduation from Saratoga. So I understand the feelings of our graduating class this year. And so we are hoping that if, again, as I said earlier, if regulations permit, that we can be able to do something close to normal in terms of a ceremony. If not, as we know, Los Gatos and Saratoga last year put something together very special for our last year's graduating class. And from that experience, we'll build upon it to, again, make it as special as possible for this year's graduating class. Both schools, the activities directors, their ASB students are all working together to try to find all the different ways that we can celebrate our students in safe ways and to be able to celebrate and honor them for their years of high school and what they've done. I'm sure Mr. Robinson, who's his first year at Los Gatos, would also love to be able to have an opportunity to do some Los Gatos tradition. But again, we will err on the side of safety for our students and our families, and then do what we can to celebrate our seniors the best we possibly can.
Next is a funding question. It says, has the district conducted any estimate of how closed campuses are affecting enrollment, particularly in terms of budget? We read that many families are opting for private schools and or moving out of the district. Lower enrollment could mean cuts to funding, which will trickle down to fewer programs and staff. This is for Dolores.
We have seen that we have a slightly larger decline, or we have a larger number in reduced enrollment than we had anticipated at our last study in our projections. However, as a community funded district, the majority of our unrestricted funds are generated through property tax in the district, as opposed to funding that's impacted by enrollment.
A health and safety question. In phases 3A and 3B, how many students will be allowed in a classroom at a time? Tony?
Yeah, as I mentioned in the presentation, prior to a phase 3A or 3B reopening, all classroom spaces are going to be evaluated for capacity limits based on air quality, square footage, and social distancing requirements. Rooms that will be outfitted with that signage that I showed, indicating the maximum allowable capacity of the space. And that number will be used to determine how we load the room with students and staff. So depending on the period of the day, the content of the class, and the number of students who choose to attend, some courses may need to be relocated to larger classrooms in order to accommodate these students' existing schedules. And we're mixing and playing with those numbers in order to make sure that we can be as least disruptive as possible on that return.
Another health and safety question, but this one has a music bent. When students return to in-person instruction, will band and choir students be allowed to play and sing? A major research study has been conducted this year that shows that they can do so safely with special masks designed for musicians, singers, and instrument covers, in addition to the same safety measures that will be in place for every other classroom. For this reason, I fully support band and choir students being allowed to sing and play their instruments during class, and I'm fully prepared to lead groups of parents in making sure every student gets the special masks and instrument covers they need. I'm happy to share all the information I've gathered in support of this plan. I think, Mike, you're going to take this?
Yep. So we're our music teachers have shared with us many of the solutions that are emerging around the country and around the world to help with safety for music and for choir. We're aware of these emerging solutions. Unfortunately, the state and county guidelines specifically restrict these activities because they're seen as posing a greater risk of transmission due to what they call aerosol production. There are pretty active efforts at the state and county level to lobby decision makers to reconsider these restrictions in light of new safety equipment and research. But until the guidelines and rules are changed, we will need to adhere to them. So I'm hopeful. I've seen some of these strategies and some of the research, and it makes sense to me that they would update the guidelines, but unfortunately I don't have control over that, but we are lobbying for that.
This is a staffing question. It says, how does the district plan on accounting for all the substitutes that will be needed should teachers choose not to come back before the vaccine is administered? It's going to be Brian.
Yeah, that's a big question. Any expansion of our staffing needs will create a large challenge for us, admittedly. Even before COVID, we were facing a teacher shortage in general and a substitute shortage in particular. I have to credit our teachers who are working remotely and doing an incredible job of keeping learning alive. Some have taught even while being COVID positive. We don't have that option, obviously, when we return to live teaching. In fact, for some of our colleagues who are worried about contracting COVID, they may have very good reason to stay away if they're predisposed to contracting COVID or have an autoimmune deficiency. So substitutes would admittedly be a very large challenge. We've been committed and remain committed to finding ways to return all students to campus for as much time as possible. With that said, if a teacher's out, there's simply no ideal replacement for a regular teacher. We've filled substitute vacancies, the few that have come up during the year, with a small cohort of long-term substitutes. And then also our staff members who are willing to take a period or two of their colleagues' classes when needed. Again, any kind of expansion into live teaching would create a much larger challenge because we would need folks to be in person with our students rather than at home taking care of themselves or children or any other outside obligations.
Another funding question. Does the district have the funding to make sure we can support all the health and safety precautions when we go back to school? Dolores?
As I mentioned in the presentation, we did receive $1.3 million in funding to address distance learning and costs associated with reopening. Those funds have been used to address a variety of needs in those areas. Currently, the legislatures are considering proposals for additional funding. We don't know what shape that will take at this point, but there are several proposals, which is always indicates that there's a lot of energy around additional stimulus for school districts. We also have existing budgets that can be used in areas that we have had savings during distance learning can be used to address some of those needs as well.
People also wanted to know about the enforcement of our health and safety plans. Question is, the plans and protocols for reopening at any phase are predicated on the understanding that students, families, and staff will all abide by social distancing rules from the county and from the school site. Even if we try to manage protocols within our classroom spaces, how do we propose to manage student interactions outside our classroom doors? This significantly increases risk for both students and staff, and by extension, everyone's families. How is the district prepared to offer some safety measures outside of the classroom space? Are parents able to ensure that their children are abiding by all the protocols? What are the consequences for students who choose not to follow protocols on campus? And how can we as a school take responsibility for everyone's health when not everyone is involved in taking these protocols seriously? Greg?
That's a great question. So ultimately, I think that we're all pretty comfortable with our ability of our teachers and staff to be able to enforce the safety protocols while inside classrooms, and maintain the social distancing shouldn't be, a challenge at all. Obviously, as the question asks, managing them outside the classroom is going to be the challenge, because as we all know, right, we're dealing with teenagers who are not always rule followers. Sometimes need to understand why they need to do certain things. To address this, we are definitely working to expand our campus supervision, make sure that there's enough adults outside in times when students are not in classrooms, to help direct them during the designated paths of travel, sort of like we hope to see in the grocery store sometimes, and other ways, right, in terms of making sure that they're wearing their masks, they're wearing them properly, maintaining the social distancing. In terms of enforcing it, again, it's going to be the greater supervision of addressing it. I think a lot of us would agree that coming to campus in this situation would be a privilege, and if a student is going to be insistent about not maintaining safety, that we can have them take their classes online from home, so we can try to do everything we can to keep everybody safe when on campus.
Question about student and staff mental health. We received a number of questions about student mental health. In essence, how are you weighing social emotional health of students with all the other factors that need to be considered? And what are you doing to support student mental health? Heath?
Yes. The mental health of our students has been at the forefront of our discussion since this pandemic began and remains at the forefront as we plan a path forward. For the first time within the district, we prioritize the use of the advisory period this school year to provide students with educational models based in CASEL's social emotional learning standards. These modules included suicide prevention as well as awareness and coping skill development for depression, anxiety, and trauma. As one can imagine, that is not enough for many of our students. Students requiring more direct intervention have received individual and group therapy, as well as more intense services in the home that included parent coaching and family counseling. We are also keenly aware that the mental health needs of our students are going to grow exponentially as we return to in-person learning, and we will be using the results of the most recent California Healthy Kids survey to guide further and more targeted mental health education and services for all students.
Question about academic success. What percentage of the student body is performing below last year's levels? And how does that compare to 2019? Again, Heath?
Yes, so 3% of our students in the district are struggling more academically when compared to the same time period last year. This number reflects students with 2 or more D or F grades. These students have been offered individual group academic tutoring, peer tutoring, mentoring, in-person cohort support, individual and group counseling, as well as I mentioned earlier, family counseling and parent coaching for those with more intense mental health needs.
And the final question that we have listed is, will teachers that are in high-risk categories be able to continue teaching their classes online? Brian?
Thanks, Jane. That's something that we're still pursuing. What I can tell you in my work with the other districts around the county, we're finding that for schools that have been open, including the elementary schools, they're taking a case-by-case approach. So individuals who are high risk or medically unavailable to return to campus would be someone that I would work with from the Human Resources Department, and we would come up with a plan to facilitate their participation in teaching. What that looked like may take an online format, but we would take this on a case-by-case basis. As mentioned, we would want to support their ability to teach to their students without increasing their risk. So we employ what's called an interactive process, which allows us to provide individual accommodations for teachers and other staff members who are unable to return. So as we get closer to our potential return, staff will hear a lot more about the interactive option for accommodations.
Okay, so as was mentioned earlier, a recording of this webinar will be available on our website, and we will also post written FAQs that include the questions we addressed this evening, as well as any questions that came in today after we began our preparation for this evening. At some point, we had to kind of figure out which questions we could answer tonight, and I know we have continued to have questions come in, but we can't answer all of them on the fly. So we will answer any questions that continue to come in as part of our written FAQs. Next week, we will send to all staff and families a written plan for 3A reopening because not everyone is able to attend tonight or will watch the webinar. So we'll have a written plan for 3A reopening, and that will be accompanied by a survey through which staff and families will be asked to commit to in-person instruction so that we can do further planning for defining cohorts, knowing what cohort sizes are going to be, and that we can prepare to be ready to implement our 3A plan. Please, if this evening spurred new questions for you, please feel free to use the questions form and submit them, and we will include them in our FAQs. So I want to thank you for attending this evening. Take care of yourselves and your families. We look forward to having your students and having our staff back on campus as soon as we can, because we miss that connection. So thank you very much and good night.